So good morning to our YouTube audience on Sunday, September 5th, Labor Day weekend 2021. And another good morning to our in-person and those live streaming in from other areas on campus. It's a privilege to be with you this morning, and I have some stories and thoughts to share. Organized around the subject of suffering. Sounds great, right? And it occurred to me to begin by noticing where we are in the calendar as it relates to, in a contemporary way, our public community's attempt to increase its consciousness and appropriateness in response to the phenomenon of addiction. So some of you who were here last week might remember that I mentioned that on Tuesday of this past week was International Overdose Awareness Day. And we thought about all of the folks who have lost their lives in the struggle, and many of them, unfortunately, even Caron patients who, the tragic circumstance that happens with some of our opioid-using patients. If they come here, they get decent treatment, they make an honest and wonderful effort at sustaining and beginning recovery, but in this curious way, this illness just never abates. They find themselves slipping back into the prey of the call of addiction, which suddenly is winning on any given day, and they don't know how much they can safely use or what is in the drugs that they're buying on the street. So they may take the same dose that they were accustomed to taking previously and suddenly find themselves no longer responsive, and their friends trying to preserve them or dying alone. It's just miserable. And that's only one of the little aspects of the suffering associated with addiction. So the other thing is International Overdose Awareness Day speaks to the earthquake that such deaths cause in communities and families. And so you are here as patients facing that risk, really. And I know not all of you shoot heroin, but that's not the only way that plays itself out. So the other piece of the calendar is that August 31st, International Overdose Awareness Day, but I often criticize Facebook, but one of the things I enjoy on Facebook is September, because in September I have tons and tons of friends, colleagues, industry acquaintances who celebrate their recovery publicly in this month. It's National Recovery Month. And what you see if you continue on this journey, you start making friends in recovery, is that even if your Facebook thread wouldn't have been filled with people giving testimony previously, as you get to know people in recovery, there's been a turn. Like in 1935, it was important for Alcoholics Anonymous to stay Alcoholics Anonymous, but in 2021, there's a need for those who are in successful long-term recovery to actually let people know that there's a way out of the hell of addiction, and to try and dispel the shame by coming forward with our heads held high and saying, hey, that's where I was, but that's not where I am today. And that's who I was then, but it's not who I am today. And so this tension between death and victory is a great way for me to sort of wander into the subject of suffering, because I think it's a complicated subject and it has a dark and a bright side. You might think, what's bright about suffering? But hang in here with me. So the next stopping point on my little mental outline is art. And I happen to also be a musician, and my mom was a poet and a painter, and I'm a student of the arts. I love the arts, and as a person also interested in philosophy and theology, I've read about art and meaning in art. And one of the things that is true, the deepest thinkers have said this. It goes all the way back. Sort of, you can think about it, in ancient Greece, you had the comic and the tragic faces. Do you know the two faces of the comic and the tragic? And comic is still, in its funny way, tragic. Humor always has a dark edge to it. But really, theorists about the arts have pointed out that art depends on the tension between tragedy and triumph. Even music depends. I could walk over to the piano and play something dark and unfinished, and you would want me to clean it up. And if we entered a story, and the story is, I mean, we all do this because Netflix does this to us all the time. It ends the season on some cliffhanger, you know the story's not over. And so this unfinished and unresolvedness is part of the nature of art. And even the mystery of a painting is its meaning, which is left unfinished until you interpret it for yourself. And also much art, when you look at visual arts, has still these complicated sort of tensions. So I'm not going to resolve it. What I'm trying to do is elucidate that there is something inherent about life and art and music and language and story, which requires this watershed between tragedy and victory. And if you happen to be a person who's inflicted with the chapel service on a regular basis, you would know one of the things I always try to do on Sundays is not only reflect about addiction and about our contemporary society and maybe about philosophy and theology, but especially about theology and wisdom traditions. So, and that's a term I really like because it embraces things as far as the Om and the Star of David and indigenous tribal forms. And I would argue that AA and the 12 Steps are a contemporary wisdom tradition. So what does wisdom say about suffering? And wisdom, too, speaks into the challenge of a world where we have death and life in a variety of ways. It speaks words of caution and guidance and comfort. And I don't think there's a wisdom tradition out there that tells you that you're going to have utopia in this world, although there is the promise sometimes of utopia beyond this world. It's the wisdom traditions of the world wrestle with suffering. And they wrestle with suffering in different ways. So Christianity's wrestle with suffering takes us to an intense moment of Jesus' death on the cross. And it's grisly and paradoxically, the easiest way to point out the weirdness of it is that they call that day in the Christian calendar Good Friday. And one would ask, like, what in the world is good about this beautiful man dying on this pair of sticks in front of an audience? It's grim. And yet there is a history of thousands of years of reverence and devotion and a kind of beauty seen in the ashes of that loss. And that's one of the wisdom tradition's voices. If you look at Hinduism, I think, in some ways is a close cousin in how it addresses suffering to Christianity, in being rich in gore. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, it's a militarist, it's like grim. And yet the sacred emerges in the midst of the battle. And both of those traditions even sort of look for the sacred right in the middle of the worst things. And then if you look at some other traditions like Buddhism, in Buddhism you have a different sort of take on the whole thing, which is let's figure out how to alleviate suffering. Let's try to diminish its impact, and let's try to help assuage ourselves. And yet Buddhism never gets away with sort of getting us out of suffering until the ultimate fulfillment of its enlightenment, which is another one of these like end destinations. We hope for the alleviation of suffering, and many of us have been with loved ones who have died and thought, oh, thank God at least their suffering has ended. Well, we're sort of stuck with it in the middle of the road here. And as people in this room, if you think about your story, or I think about my story, I think one of the hard pieces as a person who is about to embark on more recovery, which we are in every day. I'm starting today needing to decide not to pick up. So I'm embarking on the future, even though I got a bunch of days behind me in which I've been able to not drink or use a drug for intoxication. But I have the wreckage of the past behind me. And some of you have that in large measure. It's one of the hard things about being here, is that you come here on the heels of some sort of drama. And We tell you don't have to have shame because the addiction isn't your fault and it's an illness and brain disease and all that sort of stuff. But it's like, yeah, how am I supposed to not have shame? I have my third DUI, or my marriage is fizzling out, or I'm going to lose my job, or people in my life just are so pissed off at me. And it can be demoralizing to be here. And part of the demoralization of being here is directly connected to the suffering that you have been right in the midst of. Not necessarily the cause of all of it, but you've been right in the middle of it. X number of days since you got here. And the fact that you're here is some great attempt on your and Caron, and I'm assuming some Caron community's part, to try and put a stop to it, to the spiral and the trajectory that looks really dim and dark to those who are looking at it and pleading with you to come here, even if that's you yourself, right? So it's a very rare Caron patient that comes here on their own volition. If you're that person, good for you. But many of us come at the urgings of a job or the law or our colleagues and friends and loved ones, and we have to wrestle even in that moment. Look, I'm not really done yet, or I'll go next week, or I still want to smoke weed, or whatever the not yet part of recovery is that you are wrestling with, is one of the things that contributes to people's reluctance to try and do this. Plus, there's this deep fear that it can't be fixed, and you've been lured into believing, perhaps, that you are stuck in that form of suffering. That you might actually have bought into the stigmatization of addiction, which tells you that you are less than and a person that the society doesn't owe the same level of healthcare and considerations of. And that's unfortunately really true. If you look at contemporary healthcare and how it operates, it still has a bias against you because your illness is one that is blamed on you, whereas the diabetic or the other person who has heart disease, we would say, well, you look at how they their diet and exercise was a contribution factor, but it's like, oh, but that's still not the same as the person who's, smoking weed or drinking too much or whatever. And I think those lines get really fuzzy, but my point about that is that we are a community that comes awake here on this mountain out of crisis, and there is suffering right behind and around you that begs to be spoken to. And you can really wonder how the heck you're going to move forward in a positive way when it's posed like that, depending upon how grievous it is. I had a couple stories I wanted to remember, and one that just pops in my mind that I'll pull, even though I hadn't thought of it to say it today, but this is an extreme and terribly painful example of a fellow who had come here, received treatment, gotten into a period of sobriety, had resumed use of substances, and ended up back here on the heels of not only the return to use, but a grim car accident in which his driving of vehicles caused the death of 2 people. And I had the privilege of sitting with him and trying to navigate into the spiritual water of his shame and grief. And I remember when he was leaving and we had our final conversation here, I was terrified because I wasn't shocked to find out that 6 months later he took his life. And I think there's a point at which this despair around the suffering that we have been a part of can get us so down that we don't believe that we can rise out of those ashes and have triumph and victory again. But I believed he was worth my giving him love and care. And I believed had he been able to find and sustain recovery, he would have had a message for all of us that we would all need to hear. And so in some way, I try to pay tribute to my time with him by bringing that message today. Another story I had that I was thinking of on my drive in this morning was my own wreckage of my past. So I first commenced my recovery in 1989. Many of you were not born yet. But I struggled in my early sobriety, not with drinking so much, but with sanity. It was really hard for me to feel composed and together without the use of drugs, because they were my main coping tool. And I began and have continued to sustain my recovery largely on the support of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step recovery movement. Today there are other choices for people besides the 12 steps, and I'm totally excited if you will find something that will work for you that's besides that. But all I know to speak from is those steps on the wall. And I will tell you the reason I'm so devoted to them, like I am to Father Bill, like people who have helped me, is that they've helped me. And they've been a sufficient solution. They've actually made it possible for me to go from using every day to not picking up a drink or a drug for more than 30 years. And just saying that out loud helps me. I'm just like, God, is it really that long? And I would have never thought it possible. So anyway, I'm beginning my recovery, and I go through a series of sponsors, because that's part of the method there, is that you get a sponsor and you do the steps. And I made several forays into the steps. I did a couple of marginal attempts at a fourth step. But then I found this guy, Tom, and Tom helped me walk my way all the way through the 12 steps on a first kind of really thorough go-around in the kind of conventional way that is illustrated in the fundamental literature of the movement. And part of that is in the fourth and fifth step, doing an inventory of, it says there, a fearless and searching moral inventory, which is quite vague. But then if you look at the way it was described in the early literature, it's an inventory of resentments, fears, and sexual history. And it turns out, if you look at resentment, fear, and sexual history, your harm story is right in that neighborhood. Like, that's enough to tease up the crap that is in your rearview mirror. So it's not necessarily like you could say, oh, you just want to do an inventory of all the harm you caused, which eventually you do in step 8. But this is like a deep dive into your narrative and your story, and there it is. So I have this, finally, I have this manifesto of my awfulness, and I make this arrangement with Tom that I'm going to meet with him to do my fifth step, which I'm very nervous about, because everybody talked about how wonderful it's always been, and I'm like, it can't be that awesome. I just struggled with the whole moment, and I went to his house, and he and his partner Mel lived in this beautiful little waterfront area, and he was like, oh, it's good to see you, we have coffee, and then we sit in this little spot in the place, which was where he was, it was like this little mini AA shed, and we talk it through, we go through all of the bleh, and the sexual history was one thing that was very, very hard for me to talk about, and the fears I had not really come to understand until I started writing them down. The resentment thing was very real for me too, and so I felt like I had just essentially, bared everything. And I don't know what I expected, but he said, okay, Jack, you know what we're going to do? And I'm like, I read in the book, and it says I'm supposed to take an hour and pray about this. And he goes, yeah, we'll get you there. He said, do you see that leaf pile over there? It was autumn, and there's a big pile of leaves over there. I got sick in my stomach. He said, we're going to take these matches, and we're going to take your fourth step, and we're going to burn it. And I had this weird, stupid, I wish I'd made a copy of it. It was like somehow I was really attached to the dark history of my past. I didn't want to let go of it. I don't know if I fully understand it even now. But it required an act of courage for me to do it. So we went over, the leaf pile was there, he lights the leaves on fire, and then he's like, go ahead and enjoy it, have fun, laugh, whatever. And at first I was really timid, I'm throwing one. By the time I get to the 17th page, I'm ripping it up, I'm like, yay! And I had this sense of unbelievable fun and release and freedom. And I'm going to stop on my story thing because I think that captures the place I want to leave this, which is, as people who suffer from addiction, we may use drugs to try and tamp out the shame that we have, but only by doing so do we add to it. Like using drugs, I've never seen getting high help really much of anything. Except in the moment. I'm like, oh, I get the oblivion of the moment, but then I wake up and somebody's mad at me because I was, cuked at Christmas or whatever. So, this alternative, standing in front of that fire, that leaf pile, takes my suffering and uses it as a motivation to seek to live a better life, one day at a time. To understand what all that drinking cost me. And to decide I don't want to be a casualty today. I do not want to be on the death count of my loved ones today or tomorrow or in any future tomorrow. And somehow that's a message for the moment here today. We all stand in this pivotal moment, which is the now, where we can take yesterday, we cannot fix yesterday, we cannot undo yesterday, but we can use yesterday to teach us to move in healthier and better directions. And that redeems the darkness and makes it possible for people to type in on Facebook, I'm so excited, 20 years of sobriety. They don't have to talk about the horrible years before. They get to talk about 20 years of sobriety. Like, I've lived in this freedom that I've had, and you can have that too. You can absolutely have it. And if you have been struggling and not finding it, don't give up. Let us help you to redeem the misery and find the triumph that is the signature of this movement and this place.